Today, when I say there's a storm in the U.S., the last thing they think of is snow. So the Rosh Chodesh Adar is the first. Is the Yorta of the Shach. I just read up that the Shach, he accomplished so much in his lifetime, but he had a miserable life. His whole family were killed by the Cossacks, and he died himself at 41 years old. So all of the Sfarim that he wrote, he actually finished before he was 41. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
Okay, so yesterday we were discussing a machlokes in our Mishnah between the Tanakama and the Yochanan ben Broika. If the Korban Pesach became possible, not because there was a psula guf, like it became tamei, rather its bailim became tamei, or its bailim passed away, so the Korban Pesach that has no oichlin. So there's a machlokes where Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika says afal pikein it's b'sreifa, but the Tanakama said that we leave it to uber tzarasa, and we leave it till it becomes nicer or till it becomes spoiled, and only then do we burn it. So the Gemara brought down two shitas. The first shita was if the Zrika Saddam was already completed and this carbon is already completely kosher, just a question of the achila, everybody would agree that to uber tzarasa, you don't burn it right away. The machlokes in our Mishnah between Rabbi Yochanan and Breka hold you burn it is only if this occurred, the Bailam died, or the Bailam became Tamei before the Zrika. So before the carbon became finished, or before the carbon became this Ratza, before the Zrika Saddam, the Bailam died. And therefore it has a status of Absalom according to Rabbi Yochanan and Breka. Still according to the Tanakama, in that case, it would require to Ubutzarasan. So Rashi explains why is it that if the Bailim became Tamei, or if there's no more Bailim, so there's no Oichlin for this carbon, if this occurs before Zrika, why would Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika consider that a psula guf? Zokt Rashi, because if the Bailim became Tamei, they're Achmanu Dachil Pesach Sheni. So at that point, the Torah already says someone who's Tamei will bring their carbon by Pesach Sheni. Nimtzas Zrika Shloi b'Bailam. Kum T'chosh, this Zrika was made without Bailam. If they're alive in their tummy, they're supposed to be doing it at Pesach Sheni. If they're not alive, it's obvious why it's Shloi b'Bailam. And therefore, Zakrashi, Yivaveli Psulei Begufai to Zrika Psulahi. That makes it into a Pasal Zrika. And therefore, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika wants to learn that it's a Psula Guf and you would burn it. Masha'enkein, if it was after the Zrika, where the carbon was already Nisratza, then even Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika would be moida that to Uber Tzarasa. That's what we learned until now. And then Rabbi Yochanan, all the way to the end of yesterday, we learned Rabbi Yochanan, who says, Af la'achar Zrika nami machlokes. Not only will Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika hold that you burn the carbon, you burn the apostle of carbon, if this occurred before the Zrika, but even if it occurred after the Zrika, and the carbon was Nisratza, the whole problem is there's no one to eat it, even then, Dr. Yochanan, you would burn the carbon right away. You wouldn't have to wait until it becomes spoiled. Now, we need to understand why Rabbi Yochanan holds that. What is his makar? And that's going to become clear soon. But also Rabbi Yochanan holds his comment here, where he says that Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika holds that you burn the carbon right away, even if this psul occurred after this Rika, is consistent with what Rabbi Yochanan said elsewhere. Rabbi Yochanan said, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika, who is the Tana in our Mishnah that Rabbi Yochanan commented on, Rab Nechemia, and Rab Nechemia, who we're going to learn about shortly, Amru Dover Echad, they are in agreement. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika had Amaran. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika is what we're discussing, that even if the Bailam died, where the Bailam became Tomei, after the Zrika of the Carbon Pesach, it still renders the Carbon Pesach possible, and you burn it right away. Where do you see this in Reb Nechemia, Titania? Going back to the conversation that Moshe and Aaron had, When Moshe asked Aaron, why is it that you burnt this Seir Chodesh and it wasn't eaten? And Moshe was probing as to different problems. Rabbi Nechemia learns the problem was Aninas Nisrafa Zu. The carbon was burnt because Aninas. In other words, Aaron told Moshe, I'm an oinen, and an oinen may not eat from the carbon. So it's very interesting. We don't need it to get through the Gemara, but there's a very interesting conversation that occurred between Moshe Rabbeinu and Aaron HaKohen. And there's a machlokes between Nechemia and Rabbi Yehuda. What is the actual reason why they burnt that Seir Achatos? And according to Rabbi Nechemia, they burnt it because Aaron was an oinen. And there was a conversation where Moshe told Aaron, even though you're an oinen, you should be able to eat these karbonos. Normally, of course, an oinen may not eat the karbonos. But these karbonos were different. They were special karbonos that were brought by the inauguration. And Rashi tells us that Moshe specifically told Aaron to eat the mincha. He said, "Kechu es mincha anoseres meishi Hashem v'achlu baninas." And Moshe Rabbeinu thought that if you can eat the mincha, which was a special carbon special for that day, baninas, so to any karbonos that day, Aaron would have been able to eat baninas. And Aaron corrected Moshe and told Moshe, maybe only the special karbonos that were for the Yom Shmini L'Meluyim, maybe that we're allowed to eat. But this Seir Chatos, which is going to be a carbon that's going to be the Dairis we're always going to bring, who said the exemption applies to that as well? And who said that I'm allowed to eat that with an onion? In fact, I'm not allowed to. And that's why Aaron HaKohen didn't eat it. Now, the questions you might ask, how could he do the avodah? On that, Aaron HaKohen told Moshe, if I allowed one of the Kohen Hedjit to do the avodah, that would be a problem. Because a Kohen Hedjit who does avodah, when he's an oinen, the avodah is possible. However, I'm the Kohen Gadol. The Kohen Gadol is allowed to do avodah, and his avodah is kosher even when he's an oinen. So Zogt Aaron to Moshe, I was allowed to do the avodah, and the carbon is kosher. But nevertheless, I was not allowed to eat the meat because I'm an oinen. So let's think about it. If the carbon is kosher, but I can't eat the meat because I'm an oinen, that's almost identical to our case where the Zrika was already done on the carbon Pesach. The carbon Pesach is kosher, and only after that does the bialim become tamei or the bialim die. So now it's only a problem that it cannot be eaten. Zok to Gemara, aninus kala achar zrika havia. Aninus is just like achar zrika, meaning the carbon is nisrat to the damish sprint, and the only question is there someone to eat it? And nevertheless, in Aaron HaKohen's case, they burnt it right away. Because since it could not be eaten, because Aaron was an oinen, therefore the carbon was burnt right away. So too, it's logical to argue that a carbon Pesach, that the Zrika was done properly, and the only problem is that there's a ninus, and you can't eat it. I'm sorry, but a carbon Pesach, the only problem is that the Bailam are Tamar, the Bailam died, so there's no eaters for it, so too that psul should render it the Sreifa. So now at least we have an understanding.
I don't see how the whole Messiah comes from Moshe Rabbeinu, right? I don't see how Aaron could correct Moshe Rabbeinu's understanding of how things should work.
Well, it seems that Moshe Rabbeinu conceded.
Yeah, I know, which is not problematic, but it's very strange.
That Moshe Rabbeinu
yeah, well, what is he saying? I forgot. What is his argument? Why is he telling him he's right? What was the Messiah that he received?
It's funny because the way Rashi quotes it is for Aaron. Aaron said, "Moshe, you dope. You don't know what you're talking about." That's not what Moshe said. It says, "Shema lo shemata." Is it possible that maybe the halacha that you heard that I'm supposed to eat it? Is it possible that maybe it's only b'minchazu? Shikach shah yom shmini shnemaluyim nitzteves oisamincha ba'af ani moidelecha b'sir nachshain b'sir shalyim. I also agree by all the other karbonos that are special for this day. I should eat it. The chesiv of bnei Yisrael to daber lemer because he muchatas. Shem kachei shah choy v'loyim. Less than mut loyim. Avachat azu shirish choydeshu the kachei doyer saying masrun loyim. So it doesn't say when Moshe responded, but in fact, Moshe seemed to have agreed. It doesn't seem like it ended up in a dispute.
Okay. So I guess when Moshe Rabbeinu was Makabel Torah from Shemayim, he didn't receive every possible detail. There's some matters that depend on who's got the better svara.
Well, we know that there are other halachas that were not given to Klal Yisrael through Moshe, but rather through Aaron.
Well, if that's the case, why wouldn't anyone argue that? Nobody argues that here.
Now, over here, all Moshe Rabbeinu was addressing was, I know that you're allowed to eat the mincha. So Moshe said, "Oy bezoi, let's extend that to the Sir Chatos," and Aaron said, maybe not.
So obviously this was never discussed. This wasn't an issue.
The didn't make a comment directly on it.
That's right.
It seems so.
So it was open to argument. So why is he angry? Doesn't it say Vayichar Af? What triggered his anger? If it's a gray area,
messing up.
Well, yeah, right. This is the first day. This is Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the day of the inauguration.
Yeah.
So I understand, circumstances come up, you don't know what to do. But I also, there's an issue. The reason, according to Rashi, the reason we have a Mishkan is to be mechaper on the Cheta Egel. And the Cheta Egel, the whole process of building of the Mishkan, and Yaakov Bekude says, Kasher Tziva Hashem es Moshe, Kasher Tziva Hashem es Moshe, over and over and over and over again. So they want to do something exactly the way the Rebbeinu Shalom asked to do it. And if he saw a little bit of a deviation or a question mark, because the Cheta Egel is because Kasher Lo Tziva Hashem es Moshe, right? And this is Kasher Tziva
hands.
So everything has got to be exact. So here's a case that is a gray area, right? So maybe that's why Moshe Rabbeinu got angry. The nod of an Avihu died, Kasher Lo Tziva Hashem es Moshe. And they already
the main point that the Mishkan is supposed to repair, we're now being nichshel in again.
That's right. That's according to Rashi.
Very nice. Yeah. Okay, it's a nice horror. Beautiful.
But I still don't. So I guess that's why Moshe Rabbeinu got angry, because it's shades of the ego, shades of.
So he wasn't angry at Aaron. He wasn't angry at Aaron. He was angry about the whole scenario, that there was confusion.
Right, but Aaron was the target. He happened to be
the one
doing the. And he was responsible for the Cheta Egel as well, by the way. Aaron.
So he told Aaron, there you go again.
That's right. All right. It's just a very unusual circumstance here, that you expect Moshe would know the halacha, and it turns out he didn't.
I hear. When we learn about Rabbi Yehuda in a second, then it'll become even more interesting. How see what you're saying?
Doesn't it seem from Rashi's word that Moshe Rabbeinu could have taught this halacha to Aaron, and he simply forgot this halacha?
No, because Aaron was right.
Right.
Moshe conceded.
That's his problem.
So Moshe forgot.
Moshe was the one who forgot.
So maybe the Rebbe did give Moshe a specific instruction, but Moshe forgot. Okay, that could also be possible.
There are other places where it says that under different circumstances. Solemn, right? It says that he right, but here it doesn't say that.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see what Rabbi Yehuda says. So Rabbi Nechemiah learned.
Not because he got angry.
I hear.
That's what happens when you get angry. Remember, we learned
that's possible. That's possible. In those cases, that's how he got angry and therefore he forgot. Right.
So Rabbi Nechemia learned that at the end of the day, the reason why Aaron did not eat the carbon chatos was because he was 90. Rabbi Yehuda Palakasam. Rabbi Yehuda argues there, and I just want to. This is not direct us, but I want to highlight this dialogue. V'omar mipnei tumen israfa. The reason why they burnt the Sirach Chatos is because it became tummy, not because of negligence. Shenitmas ba'oinis. It became tummy through an oinis. So the high ka'ela, because the more talking about this word ka'ela, because the lashon that Aaron told to Moshe as follows: "V'daber Aaron al Moshe heina yom mikruves chatasam v'selasam of Hashem, but the krena oisi ka'ela, and you called me ka'ela." So the machlokes of Nechemia and Rabbi Yehuda hinges around how you learn that ka'ela. So our Gemara said, "Lakach nemar ka'ela." It said ka'ela because like I'm an oinen. I didn't eat it because I'm an oinen. That was the ka'ela. But Rabbi Yehuda says differently. This is not the same ka'ela that everyone is so excited about in the maftir of Pesach every day. This is a different ka'ela. But Rabbi Yehuda learns that the ka'ela was because it was nittus ba'onis. Moshe asked Aaron, so you say it became tummy by mistake? Maybe not. Maybe because you were in such pain because you lost your children, that caused you to be negligent. And maybe you became tummy because it was negligent. And that's why our Moshe was upset. You were negligent, and that caused it was an accusation. He accused Aaron, maybe you were negligent, and because of that, it became tummy. Aaron and Moshe, and Aaron told Moshe, this is fascinating. That's what you think of me, Moshe? Shani mevaze kochim. You actually are choshed me to be so negligent that I'll be mevaze kochim? Absolutely not. Ilmoni karuni ka'ela v'cha'ela. Even if tragedies that were compounded, double, triple what I had, still I would keep my wits. And loy hayisi mevaze. So the discussion was Moshe accusing Aaron of possibly being negligent, and Aaron saying, how dare you make such an accusation? So it's interesting. It was like an emotionally charged conversation.
So that explains the Yicharaf.
Because Moshe would have been upset that you were negligent. I don't care if you just lost your two kids. That's not an excuse. You're negligent. And Aaron said, whoa. This is a complete honest. It has nothing to do with negligence. I would never be negligent. Okay, so Zok Tehillah Gemara. We have now a Makor, which is Rab Nechemia and Rab Yochanan hold, that would be also the Chita of Rab Yochanan and Berka, that even though the whole psul is that it can't be eaten, but the entire carbon was done properly, it's still a reason to make streifa. Zok Gemara Rabba Moisef Af Rab Yosy Aglili. Rabba adds to this bunch the Shita of Rabbi Yosy Aglili, who also holds that when you have a psul b'bailim, you'll also burn it. The Tanya, Rabbi Yosy Aglili said, Kol ha'inyan kulai, the entire inyan, and this is talking about a different pasuk. So we had a pasuk over here that said, B'chol chatos asher yuva midama el oil mayed l'chaper b'kodesh lo yisayachel b'eish tisarif. The way we understood this pasuk, the way we touched this pasuk yesterday was, if you have a carbon chatos whose dam needs to be spritzed on the mizbech hachitzon, asher yuva midam el oil moed lechaper b'kodesh, and you wrongfully brought the dam into the hechol, that passes the carbon chatos lo yisayachel b'eish tisarif. Zokt Rabbi Yosy Aglili, that's not at all pshat in the pasuk. Pshat in the pasuk is speaking about a chatos that was done properly, and it's referring to the chatois hachitonis that are burnt outside, such as the par helam davar shel tzibur or the paranosi, which in fact you're supposed to spritz, inside the hechal. And the chatos asher yuvam midam el moyed, a chatos whose proper process is to bring the dam into the oil moyed. If you did it properly, l'chaper b'kodesh, lo yisay achal b'eish tisarif, one may not eat it, one has to burn it, which is exactly by the book. Because that's exactly what happens to these chatois. It's burnt outside. It's burnt outside of the machane. These parim are burned outside the machane. And it's speaking about a chatos that was done properly. However, vibalt, we don't need this pasuk to tell you that you burn it outside, because we know from other psukim the process of those karbanis. Therefore, when we're daik and we say that it's referring to this chatos that you by mistake by mistake the dam went out of the azara. If one of these chatos had a psul on them, and the dam went out of the azara, then it'll be ish desarif. Then you're not going to burn it out of the machna way out where you normally burn these parim. Rather, you'll burn them at a normal place where you burn psulei kachim. That's one halacha that Rabbi Yossi really extracts from this pasuk. The second halacha he extracts from this pasuk is there happens to be an isur lav to eat any one of these chatoyos that are supposed to be burnt completely outside. So he basically has a completely different understanding of this pasuk. He basically to tell us that if it became possible, then lisraif pisulein abesabira, that you will not burn them outside all the way out. I think it's all the way out of all three machanas. It's burned completely outside. Rather, you burn it in front of the bira if it was done improperly. So this is like an interesting irony that if everything went properly, you burn it much further out, and if it became possible, then you burn it with all of the normal psulim, which are right in front of the right in front of the Beis Hamikdash. Right. So Rashi v'loy chutz l'gimel machanos k'mitzvasa. So normally you would burn it chutz l'gimel machanos. Since it's possible, now you burn it closer. So it has nothing to do with the psul that was yotze. So Zok Gemara Amr Loi. So the Rabbanim who argued in basically responded to basically. So how do you know that chata shenichnes dam lafnai lafniminayin? We learned that this pasuk teaches you that if you had a regular carbon chatas whose dam was supposed to be spritzed on the mizbech achitzai and you brought it into the hechel, it'll be possible. You don't have a pasuk for that. So how do you know that it's possible? Amr Lahen, we learn it from the conversation that happened between Moshe and Aaron back to our Sirach Chatos. Hein lehuva esdama ala kodesh pnima. Moshe told Aaron, why did you burn it? The dam wasn't brought inside. Mechlal, you see from here, the nafik inami ayel dama bisreifa. If the dam left the Azara, or if the dam was brought into the Heichel, those are two reasons why the carbon chatas would have been possible, and it would have been justified that they have to be burnt. And we learn from there, ledoyres, we learned the same halacha ledoyres, that any carbon chatas whose dam is brought inside or out, it'll be possible. Now, what is so how does this translate to our shaila where the bailim are possible? So Rashi tells us that Rabbah would understand that if Rabbi Yossi really holds that if the dam was yotze, if the dam was taken out of the Azara, that passes the carbon, even though it's not, even though he doesn't consider that an internal psul, it's called like an external technicality because the dam was removed from where it needed to be. So he will equate that as well with a person who becomes puzzle to eat it, like a person became tamei. Rabbah will equate the two, and therefore we have Rabbah Shita who adds the Shita of Rabbi Yossi Aglili to the list of people who hold that if the carbon has no other problem other than there's no one to eat it or cannot be eaten, it's still b'sreifa. Rabbi Yochanan did not have Rabbi Yossi Aglili on this list because Rabbi Yochanan makes a distinction. So for damu basar chadamilsi, if the dam becomes tomei or leaves its confines of the Azara, or if the basar becomes tomei, that's one thing. That's I consider more of a psalogov. But bailim milsachriti, if the bailim become possible to eat it, that's not in the same level, and therefore from Rabbi Yossi Aglili you don't have a raya. Rabbi Yossi Aglili happens to hold that if the bailim become possible to eat it, you have to burn it anyway, like you see from we just learned. But he just told it to Yossi Aglili. Just because Rabbi Yossi Aglili said that the dam al basar that become possible the carbon and you can burn it right away, you cannot extend that as well. You can't assume that Rabbi Yossi Aglili extends that as well to if a person becomes tamei, and therefore the person is no longer ready for his carbon. Zok tahelig mishnah biter. Hatomis v'agidin v'anoiser. Bones, sinews. Or I'm not sure if gidin are sinews or if they're arteries. V'anoiser and noiser yisruv who has to be burnt. B'shisha aser on the 16th day, which is the first day chalamoid. If anybody has an article and can look up how he touches in English the word gidin, I understood them as sinews, but like tendons and sinews, not as blood vessels. But
the way it's understood in Tefillah language,
That's how I understood it as well. But if anyone has an article there, if you can tell me the English translation.
It says the sinews.
Sinews, it says.
Yeah.
Okay, so those are not blood vessels. Those are things that that are connected to muscles to give mobility. Okay, so the halach is you burn it on the first day of Chalamoid. So let's think about it. We're going to have to understand. Noiser, we know why you have to burn. We're going to have to understand why you burn at Samais. So the Gemara is going to end up talking about because there's moyach inside them, and you couldn't get it out. You couldn't extract that moyach because you're not allowed to break any bones. So that's why they have to be burnt. And Gittin the Gemara is going to discuss.
Yes. Just to explain, the article in the notes say that the term Gidden, which we have translated as sinus, refers in Talmudic Yiddish as tendons, ligaments, nerves, and even blood vessels. In short,
any stringy thing that your kids say take it out of the chicken.
Part of the anatomy that's long and string-like. Although the word sinus used today most commonly for a tendon, its older usage is in fact.
So it's any string inside. You know, when you serve your kids a chicken, your kids take that out. I don't want to eat that part. So it's all those parts. Okay, so let's see what the Gemara says. So Thomas Vagidin Vanoiser Yisrif B'Shisha Aser. What if Chal Tazayin Lias B'Shabbos? So what if the first day of Pesach was Friday, which means that the second day of Pesach is Shabbos, which, by the way, according to our calendar, would never occur. So the halach is Yisrif B'Yadzayin. You burn it on the first Chayil day of Chayil Hamoed. Burning noiser will not be doiche Shabbos, nor will it be doiche Yom Tov. Amar Rab Mori Bar Avuha, Amar Rab Yitzchak. Rab Mori Bar Avuha said in the name of Rab Yitzchak, Atomis kachim sheshimshu noiser. You have bones of kachim. Now, normally bones are not considered noiser; they're not the edible part of the animal. So Atomis kachim sheshimshu noiser mitaminus yadayim. They will be mitama your hands. And Rashi tells us that there's a derabbanan halacha that noiser is mitama yadayim. So therefore, bones that were meshamish noiser, meaning they were the receptacle in which the noiser was contained, they will make your hands tummy, meaning they'll have a status of noiser, because they are the base, they are the container of the noiser, which is Isser. Name a Messiah, let's see if we can bring a raya to the halacha of Rabbi Yitzchak from our Mishnah. So let's think about it. Exactly what are these bones? If they have no moich inside them, there should be no reason why you have to burn them at all. Just leave them to the side. Bones are not part of the meat that you eat, and it doesn't become nicer. It must be that the bones in our Mishnah that we're discussing had moich in them. So let's think about it. If the fact that this once contained noiser, now it becomes noiser, that's why they would need to be burnt. If you hold the fact that it was mishamish and noiser doesn't give it its own independent status of noiser, well then lama lahus reifa. Why should you burn them now that there's no not nitberinu? Because now that we're after the zman achila, you should be allowed to break those bones. The etzem l'sishbru boy at this point the Gemara wants to argue would not apply once it's past the zman achila. Break the bones. V'nechel tzalamoyach. Take out the moyach because that has to be burned. V'nechel tzalamoyach to do v'nisrafei. And then v'nishtinel to do. And the bones itself, just put aside. You don't necessarily have to destroy them. So why do you have to burn the bones as if they're noiser? We have a raya that the fact that the bones contain the noiser makes them also have a din of noiser, and that's why you have to burn them. And that's why Rabbi Yitzchak says that if you touch those bones, you'll be tummy. So there's a discussion. Yes.
Maybe just a silly question. Is there a distinction between having moyach and being mishamish nicer? Or the Gemara seems to use it interchangeably. Are we talking the same thing?
Yeah, if there's moyach inside the bone, so by definition the bone is being mishamish, the moyach.
So it's one and the same.
I believe so. So there's actually a discussion in the simple answer is one and the same, but there's a discussion in the Rishonim. Why is it? Why is shimush noiser noiser? Is it just because it was a receptacle? There's a shita who holds because it's boileya. Since there was noiser inside it, the bone is boileya, tam of the noiser, and that's why it becomes noiser. And this ends up being a huge shayla halacha l'maisa today, because if you hold that bone is boileya, so then bone china is boileya. If you hold bone is not boileya, then bone china is not negeya. It's not boileya. However, where it's really discussed is with dentures. Dentures are made out of bone. I didn't know that, or maybe they once were made out of bone, but there's definitely a shayla in the Achronim. Dentures that are made out of bone, are they boileya? So they bring a raya according to the Rishonim that learn that the reason for bones to be considered noisar, it's because according to those Rishonim, that's because of the belias, they would be a problem with false teeth and if you can capture them. However, they make anyway because very rarely do people use false teeth with such hot water that would be yatzei ledes, because usually the teeth are only used when they're in someone's mouth, and it would be very difficult to take into your mouth soup that's so hot. Although if you saw my grandfather eating soup, you would know that he was immune to anyone's grandfather. The older people get, they eat soup that's so hot that you can really be mekayim the mitzvah sreifa with it. Anyways,
Isn't there an issue of
going to their grandparents' house and eating soup that was so hot that you don't know how your grandfather ate it?
isn't there an
I
issue
have
of
the same
nice
question
and time?
in the Satmar mikveh as well. It's sometimes so I don't know how people get in.
I
Anyway,
remember going to my grandfather's house and getting burnt from Sreifa even without even doing anything, just from his mouth.
okay. So what do you think?
Nice and Tom, isn't that the issue of Balea?
Yes.
So if people don't taste foods that they've eaten, days earlier because they have false teeth.
Well, let me ask you a question. If you cooked chicken soup in a pot, then you cooked milk, do you actually taste the chicken in that milk?
No, you don't.
Something up the shishim. We know bleach has something up the shishim. You might not be able to easily sense it, but there is some type of taste that does transmit. Because let's see the Gemara weiter.
But if it's not noticeable, it shouldn't be an issue, should it?
It is. We know. Otherwise, why do you ever need to be batal b'shishim?
I don't know, but why do you call it nice and Tom?
Because I guess it might not be noticeable to you and me, but to a professional cook, it would be noticeable, and that's why the Gemara sometimes say, if you're not sure if it's bottle, if the Isra is bottle or not, have a goy taste it. Have a guy, a cook who's a professional, who has a sensitive tongue, and he's more aware of the taste. So vice the chayis, it is tasteable. Just the average Joe is not able to taste it, especially after Corona. Okay, so Zok to more weiter. No, you know from our Mishnah that the bones of Noisar, the bones that held Myro, have the din of Noisar as well. The kasavar boy bekosher. I said earlier that we're making an assumption that the only issue to break the bones are only when the carbon is kosher. But once it's nicer, you're allowed to break the bones, and therefore the Gemara asked, just break the bone, take the marrow out. So the Gemara here, it says if esem l'shishbu boy, and maybe our Mishnah holds boy bekosher of afilu b'pasul, and therefore you cannot break the bones. So the reason why the Mishnah says that you have to burn the bones is because they contain noiser, and you can't get the noiser out because you're not allowed to break the bone. In fact, I feel the puzzle. Is that what you're arguing? That there's an issue to break a bone even though it's puzzle? That's very difficult for us to accept. But none. Avo hamoiser betahar. If you leave over when it's tahar, meaning you didn't finish the carbon pesach on time. V'ashoiver b'tamei, and if you break the bone of a tamei carbon pesach, eino shoiver kesarboim. So you see clearly if the etzem l'shishbru boy applies even to a carbon that's not kosher, like it's noisar. If that's the case, then you should also get malchus for breaking the bone of a carbon pesach that's tamei. And you see, you don't get malchus for it. Eino shoiver kesarboim. So in fact, back to our question, the only reason why you have to burn the bones is because even if you took the noiser out by breaking them, the bones themselves are considered the mishamish of noiser, and therefore you would have a raya that's also. When do you say that you're not allowed to break the bone even after it's puzzle? That's if once upon a time it had a shasa kosher. You made this rika on the carbon pesach, and you were eating the carbon pesach. It was kosher. Since it was once kosher, therefore you're never allowed to break the bone, even though after it becomes possible. However, what if there was a problem by the rika? The dam got spilled out, the dam got tamei, and you were never machshir a basar to eat it all, so this never had a shasa kosher, there you would be allowed to break the bone. So tomorrow, Montana, the Shanalei, Ben Chahishaloi, Shasa Kosher, Laloi Hishala, Shasa Kosher. Where do you find a Tana who says such a thing? So tomorrow, Biakabi, the Tanya very explicitly, that's a Masishpur, boy bekosher, Veloy beposel. The whole Isser to break the bone is only if it's a kosher carbon, not if it's a puzzle carbon. Like Rabbi Yaakov Eimer, Hishaloi Shasa Kosher, Vinifsal, Yesh boy, Mishum Shvir Sa'etzim. If you were once allowed to eat this carbon and everything was going well, and then it became noiser, and then it became tamei after the fact, then you would still retain the issue of breaking the bone. If this meat never had a shasa kosher because the dam never was spritzed properly, then ein boy mishum shvir sa'etzem. Then there would be no isser to break the bone. Rabbi Shimon ein boy mishum shvir sa'etzem. Rabbi Shimon knows regardless, it doesn't matter if it has a shasa kosher or not. Once the carbon is not kosher anymore, it's noiser, it's tamei, or anything happens to it, there's no isser to break the bone. Meis effective more. The bones of any typical carbon. Every standard, a guy brings a shlomim and now he finishes, he doesn't have to burn the bones. The only bones that have to be burned, except for the bones of a carbon pesach, because of takala. Rashi tells us that this takala means because it's also to break the bone. Rashi says over here, takala. Because there's an isser to break these bones. So Zog to Gemara, let's analyze what type of bones we're talking about. If they're bones that have no moich in them, well then lama lus reifa. Why would you even consider burning them? Bones are not part of the carbon that become nicer. Ella pshita the isbu moich. We're talking about bones that have moich inside it, and it's saying the bones that have moich inside it, the ones from the regular bones of kachim you don't have to burn, and atamis pesach you do have to burn. If you hold the fact that these bones once held marrow, so that makes them shimish noisar, well then atamis kachim amai intunis reifa. Bones that held marrow in a regular kachim, not carbon pesach, why don't they have to be burned? Even though you could break them open and take the marrow out, but the fact is at one point they were containing the marrow, and since at one point they were containing the marrow, they should also be considered shimish noisar, and you should need to burn them. No, you already found, you didn't find bones with marrow in them, and you have a discussion, should I burn them or not? You found bones that were broken open and that all the marrow was taken out. So Thomas Kachim, if there's stam karbanis, the ein by mishum shvir sa'etzem, where there's no problem of breaking a bone, so we'll say kami in the have a noiser chiltinu. Let's assume that before this carbon became noisar, the owner broke open the bones and took the noisar out. So by the time there would be any noisar, these bones were not mishamish to noisar, v'lavishimish noisar, and therefore v'leboy sreifa. But at Tzamis Pesach, the yeshba mishmishir etzem, the bones of Pesach that you're not allowed to break. Ela levasar didn't have a noisar who dechaltinu. The only time you might have broken them is after it became noisar, because then maybe you're allowed to break the bones. So that means there was once marrow in these bones after the marrow became noisar. So therefore, Babalu Shimish noisar, and therefore Bahu Shreifa. So again, everybody holds Shimish noisar with the Shreifa, but if you find broken bones, if you found them from a regular carbon, you'll assume the person broke the bones open before it was noisar because he wanted to eat the marrow. He didn't want to have noisar. But by a carbon basic, we know he couldn't have done that. So since we know he couldn't have done that, even though now you found broken bones, you're not going to assume the bones were broken and the person ate the marrow when he was allowed to. You'll assume he only broke the bones after it became noisar. Then he took the noisar out. But now these bones have already contained noisar. What happened was you found a pile of bones. You found a pile of bones, and you check the first layer, the top layer, and you find chalutzin. You find that they're empty. They were emptied from their marrow. So the question is, do I have to check now the rest of the pile or not? Kachim the ein ba mishum shvir sa'etzem. Kachim, which there's no isser of shvir sa'etzem. Therefore, l'chulu hava chalutz v'achaluhu. We'll assume that all of the bones that I didn't check, also the marrow had already been removed, and therefore and therefore you can leave those bones. You don't have to burn them, and you don't have to check them. But at Tzamis Pesach, if these were bones of a carbon Pesach, The yeshba mishum shuris etzem, where you know you're not allowed to break the bone. Therefore, dilma hani dechaltzinu. Maybe the top layer they took the marrow out, but ulahanach loichaltzinu. Maybe the lower ones that didn't take out the meat, the marrow, and there's good reason to believe that because you're not allowed to break the bone. And therefore, ubo yisreifa, you have to burn all these bones. Amar bid amarav, kol hagidin kosher chutz megidei tzaver. All of the gidin are basar, not kosher. All of the gidin are basar. They're considered basar. You eat them, and you'd also have to burn them if they're noisar, except the gidin that are in the neck, because those, I guess, shehu alal haracha v'kosha. They're very, very hard. Ve'etz ba'alma. Zok the Gemara. It's not. Hatamis hagidin v'noisar yishrefu b'tazayin. Our Mishnah. Hani gidin in our Mishnah that says you need to burn and has a din of basar. Hechadami. Ilemi gidei basar nichlinu. Why did you? What you should have eaten them? You're talking about gidei basar that you happen not to have eaten. Well, so that's like a regular noisar. V'idi toiser hani noisar. Why do I need the Mishnah to specify that these gidin you burn if they have a din of regular meat? So then they would be included in the general heading of noisar. Elapshita, they must be different than regular meat, and they're referring to gidei tzavar. And if they're gidei tzavar and they cannot be eaten because they're very hard. So if they still have a status of basar, even though they're harder to eat, that would explain why our Mishnah says you have to burn them anyway. If you're going to tell me they don't have it in the basar because they're simply too hard, they're like eitz ba'alma, lama luhus reifa. Why does the Mishnah say they have to be burned? We're talking about the gid hanosha. The gid hanosha is not as hard, not as tough, not as difficult as the gidei tzavar. So the gidei tzavar are not considered basar; they're eitz ba'alma. They don't need streif at all. B'shar gidin basar gomer v'roy lachila, they would be considered regular noiser. The reason why our Mishnah to specify gidin is almost missing the mashma the yesh gidin shehin basar litayin shreifa ustanima in the cholim, the type of gidin that have a stat halachically they're considered basar, but generally people don't eat them. It's referring to the gid hanosha shurach v'kosher lachila. The gid hanosha could be eaten, but still most people don't eat it. The Mishnah is telling us they have to be burnt with the nicer. But leave it to Rabbi Yehuda, it's going to follow the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda. The Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer einay noig ela ba'achas. Rabbi Yehuda said that the gid hanosha only applies to one, the right or the left. However, we don't know for sure. The Torah didn't say for sure which one it is. But vadas machrash shel yamin. But minasvara, we always refer to the right one, so it's the right gid hanosha that's usher. In fact, more about tipshait the svuke misafkele the Rabbi Yehuda. Are you saying that even though Rabbi Yehuda said vadas machrash shel yamin, but it remains a suffix, and that's why you have to burn it? Because why can't you eat it? Why isn't it like regular noiser? You should have eaten it. Elamai, you can't eat either gid because you don't know if the right one is usher or if the left one is usher. So therefore, you don't eat either one. But technically, they're considered meat, and you're not eating them. That's why you have to burn it. So the mifshat pshitale, if we know for sure that it's the right one, if the das machras was something that Rabbi Yehuda said with confidence, so that he that teir nechle, let him eat the one that's on the left side, which is going to be mutter. With the isur neshadi, and the isur, the one that's usher, which you can't eat anyway, wouldn't have it in the noisher, just throw it out. So weiter, why do we need a special heading for gidden that you have to burn them separately and they're not just included under the same heading as noiser? Lamalas reifa. Really, Rabbi Yehuda holds that we know the right one's usher, the left one's not usher. The problem was we originally knew which is the right and which was the left, and they got mixed up. And since they got mixed up, therefore you're not allowed to eat either one of them. But one of them we know for sure is basar, and that's why the Mishnah is specifying that it has to be burnt. We're not talking about the gid itself, but there's a layer of fat that wraps around the gid hanosha. That's also only usher midrabanan. The Tanya Shemle mutter, Yisrael kedoshim meim, v'nehagin boy iser. Ravina Amar bechitzan. The gid hanosha actually splits into two gidin. One goes around the outer side of the bone, and one comes along the inner side of the bone. And the one that's usher midaraisa is the one that wraps around the inner side of the bone. Uchad Yehuda Amar Shmuel. The Amar Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Beis Gidin Hain, there's two Gidin, Panimi, Hasamach Letzim Usher, the one that goes on the inner thigh, that's the one that's the Usher, there's an issue there, Raisa, the Chayav and Alav, Chitzon and Hasamach Lebasher, but the outer one is Usher and Chayav and Alav. So we're speaking about that one, which is only Usher Midrabanan, and since it's only Usher Midrabanan, you're not allowed to eat it, but it's still Basar, and therefore you have to burn it also nicer. Chaltaside. Why can't I burn the Noisar on the first day of it? Famai Nese Asay, V'it Chaloisase. You have a loisase of stam burning, but you have that say that you have to Vanoishim Men Baboker Beish Tisarif. So why don't we say that say of Beish Tisarifu should be doicha the loisase of Melechas Yomtiv? Amar Chizkiya, the Vei Chizkiya, Amar Kroloi Shisiru Mimenu Ad Boiker, and then the pasuk repeats itself. Vanoishim Mimenu Ad Boiker Beish Tisarifu. Shein Tamad Loimer Ad Boiker. Why does the pasuk have to repeat the Ad Boiker? Matam Loimer Ad Boiker. Litin Loi Boiker Sheni L'Sreifasai. To tell you that don't burn it the first morning, which is the first morning of Pesach. Rather burn it the second morning, which is the second morning of Pesach, which would be the first day Chalamoid. Abai Amar. Omar Kra, Oilas Shabbos b'Shabbatoi. We had this earlier. You burn the oil of Shabbos on Shabbos. V'loy Oilas Choil b'Shabbos. But if you were makar of a carbon oila yesterday, before Shabbos, you're not allowed to burn its residual emurim on Shabbos. It's also to do that. So the carbon tamid that was brought on Friday, you must burn all of its emurim before Shabbos. Friday night, you can't continue burning those emurim because you're not allowed to burn Oilas Choil b'Shabbos. And huadin v'lo oilas chol b'yomtiv. And the carbon pesach is considered a carbon of choil because you shecht it, you make the zrika, it's fully processed on erev yomtiv. That's considered oil of choil, and you're not allowed to burn that on yomtiv. Rav Amar, which means even the emurin you wouldn't be able to burn on yomtiv. Never mind the noisar, even the emurin you couldn't burn. Rav Amar Amakra hu levada yeyasha lachem. Zok Rashi only is this in the pasuk ach dvarim for oichal nefesh. The pasuk says, "Kol melech lo yaseh b'hem, ach asher yeachel l'chol nefesh, melechas aboichal nefesh, hu levada ye'aseh lechem." That's the only thing that you're allowed to do on Yom Tov. Hu v'loy machshirov. And Rashi says, machshirov means hayechoydin le'asos miboyjoim. Anything that could have been done miboyjoim, you're not allowed to do on Yom Tov. Levadoi, where am I? Levadoi v'loy mila shaloi bismana. Who levadoi means you can't even do a mila shaloi bismana, meaning the mila on the 8th day you're allowed to do. But if it's not the 8th day, you're not allowed to do it. Haba mi kal v'chomer, because you would have a kal v'chomer, otherwise you say that you could make a mila shaloi bismana. What would the kal v'chomer be? Zokt Rashi umat tzaras, madach tzaras, that if a kohen has tzaras, shedoiches avoida, he doesn't have the mitzvah of doing the avoida. So it's doiche. The issue of tzaras is doiche, the mitzvah of doing avoida. Yet v'avoida doiches Shabbos, and avoida is doiche Shabbos. So if you're building your totem pole, tzaras is all the way on top. Underneath it comes avoida, and underneath it comes Shabbos. So tzaras is for sure more chamerdik than Shabbos. So mila, av shaloi bisman doiche isa. The mitzvah of mila is doiche tzaras, because if there's a nega right on the mokam mila, you're allowed to cut it off. So you're normally not allowed to cut off a beheres, but if it's in the Mokam Mila, you're allowed to cut it off. So you see, Mila supersedes Saras, which supersedes Avoida, which supersedes Shabbos. So therefore, Shabbos and Nitchas B'Pnei Avoida Ein Edin Shetehei Mila Doichaisa, and then you have a pasuk to tell you, Levadoi, but Mila Shaloi Bismana would not be Doicha Shabbos, even though you might use a Kavachomer to say it's Doicha Shabbos. Rabbi Yomer Shabbos and the Yom Tov is an Asehu. Not only is there a loisase of doing malach on Yom Tov, there's also an asay which prohibits you to do malach on Yom Tov. Vein asay doicha loises of asay. So even though you have an asay to burn the noisar, nevertheless it will not be doicha the asay and the loisase which prohibits you from doing this on Yom Tov. And I guess we could stop here. And the Mitzvah Shem, we will learn 7:45 Monte Shabbos. We will learn Daf Pedal. But I will be in Shul Mincha, so we could.
Oh, good.
We can learn a little. We can learn a little bit of Tanya as well. We can learn a little bit of Gemara. I'll be in Shul this Shabbos.
Yeah.
Shkoyach, good Shabbos.
Asher koyach.
Shkoyach.
Agin chodesh.
I can chodesh, yeah. I can chodesh.